Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Maple Grove Scripture Reading Podcast. Last episode, we were starting out in looking at Eliphaz's third and final speech, and we looked at the first 11 verses of Job chapter 22. And Eliphaz had this really nice philosophical opening, right? That God gains nothing from your righteousness. But in that, he was actually undermining his own retribution theology that they've all been arguing basically since, chapter 4 or something like that? There's a lot of circular reasoning coming from this with Eliphaz, where he says suffering equals proof of sin, and sin equals the explanation of suffering. And he was bringing these specific charges against Job, that he was stripping people naked, that he was withholding water and bread, that widows were leaving him empty-handed, and he was crushing orphans. And the problem with this is that none of it was true. It was all fabricated. But he concludes, that's why you're surrounded by snares. That's why it's dark. That's why floodwaters cover you. Well, today we're continuing with the same speech. We're going to look at verses 12 through 20, and Eliphaz is going to shift from what Job did, or at least what he said that Job did, to what Job believes. And what Eliphaz claims that Job believes is something that Job never actually said. So let me read the passage. Job 22, verses 12 through 20. Is not God in the heights of heaven, and see how lofty are the highest stars? Yet you say, what does God know? Does he judge through such darkness? Thick clouds veil him, so he does not see us as he goes about in the vaulted heavens. Will you keep to the old path that the wicked have trod? They were carried off before their time, their foundations washed away by a flood. They said to God, leave us alone. What can the Almighty do to us? Yet it was he who filled their houses with good things. So I stand aloof from the plans of the wicked. The righteous see their ruin and rejoice. The innocent mock them, saying, surely our foes are destroyed, and fire devours their wealth. Okay, so let's look at the first couple of verses here, and we'll give the setup. So Eliphaz is saying, God is in the heights of heaven. He is above the stars. And you know what? That is true enough. But then he says something attributing it to Job. He says, yet you say, what does God know? Thick clouds veil him. He can't see us. But the problem with that is that Job never actually said that, because Job's complaint is almost completely the opposite. In chapter 7, he said, what is mankind, that you make so much of them, that you give them so much attention? In chapter 10, he's saying that God is watching his every move. And then in chapter 21, which is just the last chapter, he says, can anyone teach knowledge to God, since he judges even the highest? So Job's problem is not that God can't see. Job's problem is that God is watching, and he's doing nothing about the injustice, not that he can't see through the clouds. Now, what Eliphaz is doing here is he's taking Job's observation that the wicked sometimes prosper without punishment, and he's twisting it. He's saying that Job must think that God can't even see what's happening. Questioning the system becomes evidence of practical atheism. And it's not a misunderstanding that Eliphaz has. I think he understands perfectly well what Job is saying, but he's misrepresenting what Job is saying. And there's a recognizable pattern to this. You say one thing, someone hears something a whole lot worse, and suddenly you're defending a position that you never actually held. So Eliphaz assigns a more extreme position to what Job is saying, and that makes it a whole lot easier to knock down. And Job, though, has been pretty careful, pretty specific with what he's been talking about with his argument. Eliphaz ignores the careful, specific thing that Job has been arguing, though. The next few verses, we get a comparison. He says, will you keep to the path that the wicked have trod? They were cut down before their time, foundations washed away by a flood. And we get a flood reference here. This is important because it references marginally, at least, back to Genesis chapter 6, Noah's generation. And if you remember the story, and you probably know it well, but there's a reason that the flood came. Wickedness was so complete throughout humanity that God was regretful in creating humans, and so he sent the waters to wipe them all away. Well, Eliphaz is placing Job on that trajectory, and that's pretty much the worst company possible that Job could keep, that kind of wickedness. And then he gives this echo of something that Job said. Eliphaz quotes, "So I stand aloof from the counsel of the wicked." And those are Job's exact words from chapter 21, verse 16, just last chapter. But when Job said it, he was distancing himself from the wicked, even while acknowledging their prosperity. It was a statement of integrity under pressure. When Eliphaz says it, he's positioning himself as righteous, and he's implying that Job is among the wicked. You got the same words, but a completely reversed meaning. Job's own statement of integrity is now being weaponized against him. In the next section, Eliphaz continues. He says, "The righteous see their ruin and rejoice. The innocent mock them." Eliphaz is describing his own posture here toward Job's suffering. So what does this mean? It's not grief, not confusion, not the silence of 7 days sitting with Job before anybody spoke. Now he's rejoicing. He and Bildad and Zophar, they are the righteous, watching God's justice land on who it's supposed to land on, Job. And Eliphaz here, he's not presenting himself as cruel. He's presenting himself as correct. In his framework, to mourn with Job, to enter his confusion, to refuse the easy verdict, it's the same thing as siding with the wicked. So the rejoicing is what's right to him. And it's so cold. It's coldness dressed up as discernment. And again, there's another recognizable pattern. When somebody's life falls apart and we've held a certain view of them, then we've got a temptation toward some kind of grim vindication where we say, you know what, I always suspected that. And see, I was right. So righteousness becomes being on the correct side of somebody else's disaster. Now let's see where Eliphaz has ended up. He started this whole dialogue with hope and vision, a gentle urging, the 7 days of silence even. But now, man, he's watching Job burn and he's calling it justice and calling himself righteous for recognizing it. And that's worth marking, how far we've come. Next time, we're going to finish chapter 22 with Eliphaz's final movement where he pivots almost completely and he turns to an appeal for Job to return to God. The tone shifts, which makes this moment of cold satisfaction all the more jarring in contrast. We'll get to that next time, though. I do hope you have a great day, and we'll talk again soon. God bless.